Margaret Harper never imagined that after burying her husband, she would stand in a bank lobby begging for just one more chance to save the family orchard that had been passed down for 3 generations. Instead, the loan officer quietly slid the foreclosure papers across the desk and told her there was nothing more the bank could do. Outside, word spread quickly through the small town. Some people shook their heads with sympathy, while others whispered that an aging widow had no chance of keeping such a large farm on her own. A few even laughed, saying it was only a matter of time before the auction signs went up and another developer turned the old orchard into expensive houses. Heartbroken, and with nowhere else to turn, Margaret returned home to pack away her husband's belongings before the bank took everything. Hidden beneath a loose wooden board inside his old workbench, she discovered a weathered notebook wrapped carefully in cloth. Across the first page, in her husband's familiar handwriting, were just 8 simple words. If you're reading this, they finally need to know. What Margaret uncovered in the next few pages would not only change the fate of the orchard forever, it would reveal a lifetime of quiet kindness that no one, not even his own wife, had ever known about. But before we open that notebook together, I'd love to know where you're listening from and what time it is where you are. If you're starting your morning, I hope today brings you peace, good health, and a reason to smile. If you're listening tonight, I hope this story helps you unwind after a long day. Please leave a comment with your city or country. And if stories about hope, community, and ordinary people doing extraordinary things speak to your heart, don't forget to subscribe and join us for many more unforgettable journeys. The church had never felt so quiet to Margaret Harper. Sunlight streamed through the stained glass windows, casting soft colors across the polished wooden pews where neighbors, lifelong friends, and distant relatives sat with bowed heads. Fresh white lilies surrounded the simple oak casket at the front of the sanctuary, filling the air with their sweet fragrance. Ethan had always joked that he preferred the scent of apple blossoms to flowers from any florist. And despite herself, Margaret almost smiled at the memory, before grief settled heavily over her again. 57 years old was far too young, everyone had said. A sudden heart attack while repairing an irrigation line had taken him before the ambulance even reached the orchard. It had happened so quickly that Margaret still caught herself expecting to hear his boots crossing the porch every evening. The pastor spoke warmly about Ethan's quiet faith, his dedication to his family, and his lifelong love for the Harper orchard. He described a man who rarely sought attention, but was always willing to help whenever someone needed an extra pair of hands. Margaret listened without really hearing the words. Her fingers remained wrapped around the folded funeral program as if letting go of it might somehow make the last few days more real. When the service ended, people formed a slow line to offer condolences. Ben Walker embraced her gently without saying much. He had farmed the neighboring dairy for nearly 30 years and had known Ethan since they were teenagers showing livestock at county fairs. "If you need anything," Ben said quietly, "anything at all, just call." Margaret thanked him with a tired smile. She had heard the same promise dozens of times that morning. She appreciated every word, yet none of them could change the empty seat waiting at her kitchen table. Lily arrived beside her after speaking with several old family friends. At 27, she had inherited Ethan's calm eyes and Margaret's determined expression. She squeezed her mother's hand as they watched the last guests leave the church. "Come stay with me for a while," Lily suggested softly, "just until things settle down." Margaret shook her head. "The orchard needs looking after." "Mom, it'll still be there tomorrow." Margaret looked toward the church doors where sunlight spilled across the steps. "Your father never missed a day's work if he could help it." Lily didn't argue. She knew better than anyone that the orchard had always been more than land to her parents. 3 generations of Harper hands had planted, pruned, harvested, and cared for those trees. Every season carried memories. Every row held part of their family's history. The drive home felt strangely unfamiliar, despite roads Margaret had traveled thousands of times. Ethan usually drove while talking about weather forecasts, fertilizer prices, or which apple varieties looked strongest that year. Now the truck seemed painfully quiet. As they turned onto the gravel lane leading to the farmhouse, the orchard stretched across gentle hillsides beneath the afternoon sun. Thousands of apple trees stood in neat rows, their leaves moving softly in the breeze. They looked exactly as they had a week earlier, untouched by the loss that had changed everything. Inside the farmhouse, casseroles and sympathy cards covered the kitchen counters. Lily began organizing food into the refrigerator, while Margaret wandered through rooms that suddenly felt much larger than before. Ethan's jacket still hung beside the back door. His reading glasses rested on the end table next to his favorite chair. A half-finished crossword puzzle lay folded exactly where he had left it. She reached for the glasses before pulling her hand away. She wasn't ready. Late that afternoon, after Lily returned to her apartment with promises to visit the next morning, Margaret noticed several unopened envelopes tucked beneath the kitchen mail basket. During the days surrounding Ethan's death, she had ignored nearly everything except funeral arrangements, assuming they were ordinary bills. She carried them to the table and began opening them one by one. Utility statements came first, then medical invoices from the hospital, larger than she expected. Finally, she opened a certified envelope from the bank. Her eyes paused on the first sentence. Past due notice. She frowned and read more carefully. The letter referred to a commercial agricultural loan secured by Harper Orchard. According to the notice, multiple payments had fallen behind, and a substantial balloon payment had reached maturity 2 weeks earlier. Margaret read the paragraph 3 times before she fully understood what it meant. Ethan had always handled the business finances. She knew they still owed money from expanding the orchard years ago, but she believed the loan was manageable. The amount listed on the notice was far larger than anything she imagined remained unpaid. Confused, she searched through Ethan's office desk. Inside neatly labeled folders, she found tax records, equipment receipts, insurance papers, and loan documents. The numbers slowly formed a picture she had never seen before. Medical expenses from Ethan's previous heart treatments had drained much of their savings. Several poor harvest seasons caused by late frosts had forced them to refinance equipment. The original orchard loan had eventually been consolidated into a larger commercial note with a balloon payment due this month. Ethan had apparently expected another strong harvest to refinance again, but his death had changed everything. Margaret sat silently at his desk as evening shadows stretched across the room. There were no hidden fortunes, no overlooked investments, only careful records showing a man who had done everything possible to protect both his family and the orchard. The following morning, she drove to the local bank carrying every financial document she could find. Daniel Ross, the branch manager, greeted her with genuine sympathy. He had attended Ethan's funeral the previous day and invited her into his office without unnecessary formalities. Together they reviewed the loan file. Daniel spoke gently, explaining each page while answering every question she asked. Margaret learned that because Ethan had been the primary borrower and because the orchard's income alone no longer satisfied lending requirements, refinancing would require proof of financial stability she simply could not provide. "I'm truly sorry," Daniel said quietly. "I've reviewed every available option before this meeting." Margaret looked across the desk. "If I keep working the orchard, it isn't about effort. The bank has lending policies I can't override. I've lived on that farm my entire life. Daniel lowered his eyes for a moment. I know. There has to be something. He hesitated before answering. Without full payment or approved refinancing, the loan will enter foreclosure. Margaret thanked him politely despite the crushing disappointment settling inside her. Daniel walked her to the lobby and assured her he would notify her immediately if any alternative became available. But neither of them pretended hope was likely. She drove home beneath gray afternoon skies, barely noticing the familiar roads. When she reached the orchard, she left the truck near the barn and slowly wandered between the rows of apple trees. Bees drifted among the blossoms while birds called from distant fence posts. The orchard carried on with quiet determination, indifferent to banks, paperwork, and grief. Margaret eventually found herself standing beside the old wooden bench where Ethan often rested after long days of pruning. Resting beneath it was a weathered notebook stained by years of dirt and rain, one she recognized as the small journal he often carried while working among the trees. She brushed away the dust and held it gently against her chest as the wind rustled through the branches overhead. Before she could decide whether to open it, a postal truck pulled into the driveway. The carrier stepped out holding another certified envelope. Margaret signed automatically, thanked him, and stood alone in the fading light as she unfolded the document. Across the top of the first page, in bold official print, were the words she had prayed never to see. Notice of foreclosure and public auction. Margaret left the foreclosure notice folded on the kitchen table, unable to bring herself to look at it again. The words remained fixed in her mind even after she walked outside. Public auction. Those two words echoed louder than the birds singing among the orchard rows. She picked up Ethan's weathered notebook from the porch where she had set it the evening before, intending to read it. But every time she opened the cover, her thoughts drifted back to the bank's letter. Instead, she slipped the notebook into the pocket of her work jacket and headed toward the equipment shed. The orchard could not wait simply because her heart was broken. Spring pruning still needed attention, irrigation lines required inspection, and several rows of young trees had to be checked after the previous week's windstorm. Ethan had always insisted that fruit trees rewarded consistency, not emotion. Margaret repeated those words silently as she gathered pruning shears and gloves. By mid-morning, she had finished only a fraction of the work Ethan usually completed before lunch. She climbed down from a ladder, rubbing her aching shoulder. The physical labor itself was familiar. The silence beside her was not. Every decision reminded her of how naturally they had shared the work. Ethan had known exactly which branches to remove, which trees needed extra fertilizer, and which irrigation valves always stuck after winter. Alone, every task seemed twice as difficult. A pickup truck rolled slowly into the yard. Ben Walker climbed out carrying 2 paper cups of coffee. "Thought you might need a break," he said. Margaret accepted the cup with a grateful smile. They sat together on the old bench overlooking the orchard. For several minutes, neither spoke. They simply watched the breeze ripple through thousands of fresh green leaves. "It's beautiful this year," Ben finally said. "Your husband would have liked how it's coming along." Margaret nodded. "He should be here to see it." Ben understood there were no words capable of easing that truth. Instead, he asked practical questions about irrigation and fertilizer deliveries. Eventually, Margaret mentioned the foreclosure notice. Ben remained quiet for a long moment. "I'm sorry," he said softly. "I wish I could tell you it'll work itself out." "The auction's in less than 2 months. Have you talked with Daniel?" "He already looked for every option." Ben stared across the orchard. "If you need help with the harvest," Margaret interrupted gently. "I appreciate it, but I have to figure this out myself." Ben didn't argue. He knew her well enough to recognize both her pride and her determination. Before leaving, he placed a hand on her shoulder. "Call anyway, even if it's just because one tractor won't start." After he drove away, Margaret returned to work until exhaustion forced her back inside. The farmhouse felt unusually cluttered despite its emptiness. Bills remained stacked on the kitchen counter beside sympathy cards from neighbors. She sorted through them carefully, setting aside anything requiring immediate attention. By evening, she realized there simply wasn't enough money to keep paying every expense while also preparing for the coming harvest. The next morning, she made another difficult decision. If she couldn't save the orchard through refinancing, perhaps she could reduce the debt enough to buy more time. She walked through the equipment shed carrying a notepad. Ethan had maintained every machine carefully. The older utility tractor still ran well. Several trailers remained in good condition. There were spare cultivators, ladders, storage racks, and a small cider press they rarely used anymore. Listing each item felt strangely personal, as though she were taking inventory of pieces of their shared life. She photographed several machines and contacted a local agricultural equipment dealer. By afternoon, the dealer arrived to inspect them. He offered fair prices based on market value, but Margaret quickly understood the painful reality. Even selling nearly everything she could spare would barely make a dent in the loan balance. After the dealer left, she crossed another item off her list. Hope had become arithmetic, and the numbers refused to cooperate. That evening, Lily returned after school carrying groceries and fresh determination. She immediately noticed the equipment inventory spread across the kitchen table. "You're selling the tractors?" she asked. "Only what we can manage without." Lily studied the list before looking at her mother. "You're trying to do all this alone?" Margaret folded the papers. "It's my responsibility. It's ours." "No, sweetheart. Dad was my father, too." The words hung quietly between them. Lily took a slow breath before continuing. "Let me stay here for a while." Margaret hesitated. "You have your apartment, your students." "Second graders survive substitute teachers. My mother shouldn't have to survive this by herself." Margaret looked toward the window overlooking the orchard. She wanted to refuse, to protect Lily from the stress surrounding the farm, but she no longer had the strength to pretend everything remained under control. "All right," she said softly. "Just for a little while." By the weekend, Lily had moved into her old bedroom. She organized unpaid bills, answered phone calls, and prepared simple meals while Margaret worked outside from sunrise until dusk. Together, they managed the daily routines. Yet the workload remained overwhelming. Ethan had quietly carried countless responsibilities neither of them had fully appreciated. Irrigation schedules, supply orders, equipment maintenance, seasonal labor planning, bookkeeping. Each day uncovered another task demanding attention. One afternoon, Lily found her mother trying to repair a damaged irrigation valve alone. "Dad usually fixed these in 10 minutes, Margaret admitted. Lily handed her the wrench. "Then we'll learn how." They spent nearly an hour studying old maintenance notes before the water finally flowed correctly again. Both women laughed with relief, their first shared laughter since the funeral. It faded quickly, but it reminded Margaret that grief did not erase every ordinary moment. A few days later, Clara Jenkins arrived carrying 2 carefully protected boxes from the town library archives. At 71, Clara had spent decades preserving local history and knew nearly every family story in the county. "I thought these might interest you," she said. Inside the boxes were yellowed newspaper clippings spanning nearly 40 years. Headlines celebrated record apple harvests, county fairs, school visits to the orchard, and annual community cider festivals. Ethan appeared in only a handful of photographs, despite organizing many of the events. "He always stood in the back," Clara said with a smile. "He preferred everyone else to be in front of the camera." Margaret slowly turned each brittle page. She had forgotten some of the photographs entirely. One showed Lily as a little girl handing apples to nursing home residents. Another captured Ethan teaching local children how to plant young trees during an Arbor Day celebration. Clara watched quietly as Margaret lingered over each memory. "Your family has been part of this town for a long time," she said. Before leaving, Clara noticed the weathered notebook resting near the kitchen window. "Is that one of Ethan's orchard journals?" Margaret nodded. "I haven't had the heart to read much yet." "He carried those everywhere," Clara replied, "always writing something down." After Clara left, Margaret finally opened the notebook. The first pages contained familiar observations about rainfall, blossom dates, pruning schedules, and harvest estimates. Ethan's handwriting was neat and deliberate. Each season carefully documented. She turned another page expecting more farming notes. Instead, she found a heading written across the top in slightly larger letters: "People who repaid kindness by living well." Margaret frowned gently. Beneath the title appeared a list of names she recognized from around town, followed by short handwritten notes she had never seen before. She stared at the first entry, uncertain what it meant, and slowly turned the page to discover there were many more. Margaret remained at the kitchen table long after sunset. The old orchard journal opened before her. Outside, a gentle spring rain began tapping softly against the windows, but she barely noticed. Ethan's handwriting filled every page with the same careful precision he had always used while recording harvest yields or weather conditions. Yet these entries were different. Instead of orchard notes, each page listed names followed by brief memories. The first belonged to Carl Henderson, a mechanic who still owned the repair garage on the edge of town. Beneath his name, Ethan had written, "Lost his father at 19. Couldn't afford tractor repairs. Fixed his engine anyway. Refused repayment. Years later, he hired 3 young apprentices. Kindness repaid by giving others work." Margaret read the paragraph twice. She remembered Carl bringing homemade pies to their anniversary picnic one year, but Ethan had never mentioned repairing his tractor without charge. The next name belonged to Emma Lewis, now the principal of the local elementary school. Ethan's note explained that decades earlier, when Emma was a young single mother, she had quietly worried about feeding her children during a particularly harsh winter after losing her job. Every Friday evening, boxes of apples and fresh vegetables had appeared on her porch without a note. Ethan ended the entry with one sentence. She believed an angel helped her family. I believed children shouldn't go hungry. Margaret covered her mouth with one trembling hand. She had packed apples into crates beside Ethan every autumn, never asking why several boxes disappeared before harvest sales began. She simply assumed he had donated them through the church food pantry. Apparently, many gifts had found their own quiet paths. Lily joined her with 2 cups of tea and noticed tears resting in her mother's eyes. "What's wrong?" Margaret turned the journal toward her daughter. Together they read another entry. This one described hiring a shy 16-year-old named Thomas during one difficult summer after the boy's father had been injured in a logging accident. Ethan wrote that Thomas insisted on earning every dollar rather than accepting charity. Years later, the final line explained, "Thomas graduated from college and eventually became an engineer." Still sends Christmas cards, Ethan had noted in the margin. Lily looked up slowly.
Dad never told us any of this.
Margaret shook her head.
Not once.
Over the following days, they returned to the journal every evening after finishing work in the orchard. The entries stretched across several years. Ethan rarely described dramatic gestures. Instead, he recorded small acts that seemed ordinary at the time. He loaned equipment without charging rental fees. He quietly paid for veterinary care when a neighboring farmer faced losing his dairy herd. He employed teenagers whose families struggled financially, always insisting they were helping him more than he was helping them. One page contained only 3 short sentences. Mrs. Carter's furnace failed 3 days before Christmas. Bought the replacement anonymously. Warm homes make better memories than wrapped presents. Margaret leaned back in her chair, trying to remember where Ethan had disappeared that December. She finally recalled him claiming he needed a replacement part for the cider press. She smiled sadly. Even then, he had hidden generosity behind ordinary errands. The journal changed how she saw countless moments from their marriage. Things she once considered routine now carried quiet meaning. Ethan often returned home late with muddy boots and vague explanations about helping someone for a little while. She had never questioned him because helping neighbors was simply who he was. She had just never realized how often it happened, or how carefully he kept those stories private. One Saturday morning, while Margaret repaired broken fencing near the eastern orchard, a pickup truck stopped beside the gate. Carl Henderson climbed out carrying a small toolbox. "Ben said you were fixing fence posts," he called. Margaret thanked him but explained she could manage. Carl smiled. "Maybe. But I owe your husband more Saturdays than I can count." Before Margaret could answer, he began tightening loose braces and replacing damaged wire as naturally as if he had always worked there. During lunch, she asked why he had said that. Carl rested his elbows on the picnic table. "When I was 19, my tractor died during planting season. I couldn't afford repairs, and I figured I'd lose the family farm." He laughed softly. Ethan showed up with a toolbox before sunrise, worked half the day, never accepted a dime. Margaret remained quiet. Carl looked toward the orchard stretching across the hills. "He told me that someday I'd have the chance to help someone else. Said that's how neighbors keep a town alive." He packed away his tools before standing. "I've tried to remember that ever since." After he left, Margaret found herself staring at the repaired fence. Ethan's words from the journal suddenly sounded less like isolated memories and more like a pattern. He never measured kindness by repayment. He measured it by what happened afterward. A few days later, Emma Lewis visited the orchard carrying a basket of homemade bread. She had heard about the foreclosure through friends and wanted to offer condolences. As they stood together beneath blooming apple trees, Margaret carefully mentioned finding Ethan's journals. Emma's eyes widened. "Did he ever write about winter of '98? Margaret nodded. "He wrote about apples appearing on your porch." Emma laughed through tears. "For years I wondered who left them there." She looked down at the basket in her hands. "Those apples fed my boys every weekend that winter." Margaret quietly repeated Ethan's final sentence from the journal entry. Emma covered her face for a moment before whispering, "I should have thanked him." "I don't think he wanted thanks," Margaret replied. Emma smiled sadly. "That's exactly why he deserved it." As word slowly spread that Margaret had begun reading Ethan's journals, more people stopped by the orchard than usual. Some came to buy apples from the remaining storage. Others simply checked on her after hearing about Ethan's passing. Nearly every visit ended the same way. Someone would mention a forgotten favor, a quiet loan, unexpected work during difficult times, or produce delivered without explanation. Margaret listened more than she spoke. She realized she had lived beside extraordinary generosity without ever recognizing its full reach. Lily noticed the change as well. "Dad never wanted people to feel indebted," she said one evening. "That's why nobody knew how much he helped." Margaret looked across the orchard, where a sunset painted the rows of trees gold. Maybe that's why he wrote everything down instead. Not so people would thank him, so he'd remember that kindness mattered. Life on the orchard remained difficult despite the comforting discoveries. Equipment still needed repairs, bills continued arriving. The foreclosure deadline crept steadily closer. Every afternoon, Margaret crossed another task off her growing list, while wondering how many more weeks remained before strangers would own the land her family had cared for across generations. Yet the journal gave her something she had not felt since Ethan's funeral. It reminded her that although grief had ended one chapter of her life, it had not erased the goodness he left behind. One evening, after finishing irrigation work, Margaret returned to the farmhouse to find a plain white envelope tucked beneath the front door. There was no postage, no return address, and no note inside. Instead, she found a receipt from the local utility company. The overdue orchard electricity bill had been paid in full. At the bottom, where the payer's name should have appeared, someone had written only 3 words in careful handwriting: "Passing it on." The anonymous payment of the orchard's overdue electricity bill remained on Margaret's kitchen table for 2 days. She turned the receipt over repeatedly, hoping to find some clue about who had delivered it. But there was nothing beyond the handwritten words. Passing it on, she considered calling the utility company, then decided against it. Whoever had paid the bill clearly wished to remain unknown. The gesture reminded her so much of Ethan that it brought equal measures of comfort and sorrow. He would have appreciated kindness given without expectation of recognition. The following morning, Margaret resumed pruning one of the oldest sections of the orchard. The trees there had been planted by Ethan's grandfather decades earlier, their thick trunks twisted by age but still producing sweet fruit every autumn. Lily worked several rows away, carefully recording irrigation repairs and updating the orchard's expense ledger. They had settled into a routine born of necessity. Mornings belonged to the orchard. Evenings belonged to bills, paperwork, and Ethan's journals. Just before lunch, another vehicle pulled into the farmyard. Margaret expected a delivery truck, but instead recognized Mrs. Evelyn Carter climbing slowly from the passenger seat. Her grandson helped her carry a small basket toward the porch. Margaret hurried over to greet them. "You shouldn't have come all this way," she said kindly. Evelyn smiled. "I needed to." They sat together beneath the shade of an old maple tree while Lily brought glasses of iced tea. Evelyn looked across the orchard before speaking. "Many years ago, my furnace stopped working 3 days before Christmas." Margaret nodded quietly. She already knew the story from Ethan's journal. "I never discovered who paid for the replacement until last week," Evelyn continued. "Emma Lewis told me about your husband's notebook." She laughed softly. "All these years, I thanked the wrong people." Margaret felt tears forming. "He never told me either." Evelyn reached across the table and gently squeezed her hand. "That was Ethan." Before leaving, Evelyn handed Margaret the basket. Inside were homemade preserves and a folded photograph showing children gathered around a Christmas tree many years earlier. "Those children stayed warm because of your husband," she said. "I wanted you to have that memory too." After she left, Margaret carefully placed the photograph inside Ethan's journal. As the days passed, Similar visits became increasingly common. Some lasted only a few minutes. Others stretched across entire afternoons as old memories resurfaced. A retired mail carrier described how Ethan quietly repaired her roof after a storm damaged it while her husband recovered from surgery. A former orchard worker remembered Ethan paying his wages through an entire month after a broken leg prevented him from working. A young mother explained that Ethan had once driven through heavy snow to deliver medicine when roads were nearly impassable. Margaret found herself hearing stories about the man she had loved for more than 30 years. Yet each one revealed another piece of his life that had unfolded quietly beyond her sight. None of the visitors praised Ethan dramatically. They simply spoke with deep gratitude, as though recalling someone who had appeared exactly when life seemed most difficult. Lily soon realized those conversations deserved to be preserved. One evening, she carried a small digital recorder from her apartment and placed it on the kitchen table. "What are you doing?" Margaret asked. "Saving these stories. People are just remembering your father." Lily smiled gently. Exactly. The next visitor agreed to let Lily record the conversation. Then another did the same. Soon, each afternoon brought another voice describing another forgotten kindness. Lily organized audio files by name and date while adding notes from Ethan's journal whenever the stories matched. Margaret watched her daughter work with quiet admiration. "You sound like Clara," she said. Lily laughed. "I learned from the best librarian in town." Clara Jenkins herself arrived later that week, carrying several oversized archival folders. She spread old photographs carefully across the dining room table. There were images from harvest festivals, school tours, volunteer planting days, and county fairs stretching back almost 40 years. Ethan appeared in many of them, though almost always at the edge of the frame. In one photograph, he was lifting a crate while children smiled toward the camera. In another, he stood beside volunteers repairing a storm-damaged barn. "He had a remarkable talent," Clara observed. "He always managed to make everyone else the center of the picture." Margaret slowly examined each photograph. "I never noticed." "That's because he intended it that way." Clara removed one final newspaper clipping from the folder. The article described a devastating ice storm nearly 25 years earlier that had damaged dozens of farms throughout the county. Several volunteers were pictured clearing fallen trees from roads. Ethan's name appeared only once near the bottom of the article, among a long list of helpers. "The reporter told me afterward that Ethan refused an interview," Clara recalled. "He said too many other people had worked just as hard." Margaret smiled faintly. "That sounds exactly like him." As Clara gathered the photographs, she paused thoughtfully. "Your husband understood something many people never do." "What's that?" "Communities don't become strong because extraordinary people appear. They become strong because ordinary people quietly help each other over many years." Those words stayed with Margaret long after Clara returned to the library. The orchard still faced foreclosure. Bills still outweighed income. Yet she no longer felt quite as isolated standing among the trees. Every story she heard seemed to connect another invisible thread between the orchard and the town surrounding it. One Saturday morning, Ben Walker arrived before sunrise, carrying work gloves and several extra ladders. Margaret frowned with mild confusion. "Planning a big job?" she asked. Ben looked toward the orchard before answering. "Not just me." Within half an hour, 3 neighboring farmers drove into the yard soon after. 2 retired orchard workers appeared carrying pruning tools. By mid-morning, nearly a dozen familiar faces stood waiting near the equipment shed. Margaret hurried over. "What's going on?" Ben removed his cap. The orchard needs more work than 2 people can finish before harvest. I can't afford to hire anyone. Nobody's asking you to. Margaret shook her head. I can't accept free labor. Ben smiled kindly. Did Ethan ever ask the people he helped to earn permission first? She hesitated. That's different. No, he answered gently. It's exactly the same. Margaret looked around at the gathered volunteers. Some had stories recorded in Ethan's journal. Others simply knew him through years of neighboring farms and shared harvests. She wanted to refuse again, but the exhaustion she carried every evening reminded her she could not manage everything alone. At least let me feed everyone lunch, she finally said. Several people laughed warmly. Now that, Ben replied, sounds like something Ethan would have insisted on. The volunteers spread through the orchard with practiced efficiency. Some repaired fencing while others pruned trees, cleaned irrigation ditches, or serviced equipment. Margaret worked beside them rather than directing them, grateful beyond words even if she struggled to express it. During lunch beneath the oldest apple trees, conversations drifted naturally from farming to memories of Ethan. Laughter returned to the orchard in a way Margaret had not heard since before the funeral. As the afternoon drew to a close, Ben gathered everyone near the farmhouse porch. He looked around at the familiar faces before turning toward Margaret. We've all been talking, he said. Margaret sensed something in his voice that made her set down the basket she was carrying. Ben smiled. This town isn't finished helping yet. Ben waited until the last volunteer had gathered near the porch before explaining what the town had discussed. Margaret stood beside Lily with her arms folded tightly, already uneasy at the attention. We want to hold a fundraiser for the orchard, Ben said. Not one event, several. Margaret immediately shook her head. No. A few people exchanged glances, but Ben remained calm. You haven't heard the plan. I don't need to. Everyone has already given time, labor, and supplies. I'm not taking money, too. Lily touched her mother's arm. Mom, at least listen. Ben explained that Clara had offered the library lawn for a weekend market. Local families wanted to donate baked goods, preserves, crafts, and produce. The school was willing to organize a small coin drive, and several musicians had volunteered for an evening concert at the community hall. None of it would involve loans or promises of repayment. It's simply neighbors helping neighbors, Ben said. Margaret looked toward the orchard where people had spent the entire day repairing work Ethan once handled himself. Gratitude pressed against the pride she had relied on since his death. What if it isn't enough? She asked. Then we'll know we tried, Ben replied. The answer frightened her because trying publicly meant failing publicly if the auction still happened. Yet everyone was waiting, not with pity, but with the same patience Ethan had shown others. Margaret finally nodded once. Only if no one gives more than they can afford. Ben smiled. That's fair. By the following morning, handwritten signs appeared in shop windows throughout town. Save Harper Orchard was printed across the top, followed by dates for the market, concert, and community supper. Lily created a simple donation ledger so every dollar could be tracked. Clara insisted on transparency, while Ben handled volunteers and event supplies. Margaret tried to keep working as though nothing had changed. But strangers began stopping at the orchard with jars of jam, knitted blankets, handmade birdhouses, and boxes of books to sell. Each donation came with a story. A bakery owner remembered Ethan delivering apples without charge after a kitchen fire destroyed her inventory. A retired teacher recalled school children visiting the orchard every autumn, even in years when their class could not afford the field trip fee. Margaret thanked each person, though accepting their generosity still felt like carrying something too heavy. The first fundraiser took place on the library lawn beneath strings of borrowed flags. Tables stretched along the sidewalk, crowded with pies, bread, garden vegetables, crafts, and second-hand books. Clara kept the cash box while Lily recorded sales. Margaret had planned to stay at the orchard, but Lily refused to let her hide. "They're not doing this around you," she said. "They're doing it with you." When Margaret arrived, applause rose unexpectedly from the crowd. She stopped at the edge of the lawn, embarrassed and overwhelmed. Ben came beside her. "Just smile," he whispered. "No speeches required." For several hours, she spoke with neighbors and visitors who bought far more than the goods were worth. Children emptied jars of coins onto the donation table. Farmers purchased pies from their own wives and carried them away laughing. By sunset, the market had raised several $1,000s. It was more money than Margaret expected, but still only a small portion of the debt. She studied the total that evening and forced herself not to calculate how far they remained from success. 2 days later, Lily's students held their coin drive. Each child decorated a paper apple and wrote one reason farms mattered. Some wrote food, others wrote animals, trees, or family. One child wrote, "Because people need places that remember them." Lily brought the paper apples home and taped them across the farmhouse kitchen. Margaret stood beneath them, reading each uneven sentence until she had to turn away and wipe her eyes. The charity concert filled the community hall the following Friday. Local musicians performed folk songs, church hymns, and old country tunes Ethan had loved. Margaret sat between Lily and Clara while Ben moved through the room setting out chairs and checking donation jars. Near the end, a former orchard worker stepped onto the stage and described how Ethan had hired him during the worst year of his life. "He didn't save me with money," the man said. "He gave me work when I needed to believe I was still useful." The room became completely still. Margaret lowered her head, wishing Ethan could hear what people were finally saying about him. After the concert, the fundraising total climbed again. The community supper added more. A farmer's market in the next county offered a collection table. Local businesses promised small matching donations. Yet the loan balance remained enormous. Medical debt, refinanced equipment, penalties, and the balloon payment had created a number too large for bake sales and concerts to erase easily. Margaret knew everyone understood that, even if they avoided saying it aloud. Her discomfort grew with every new contribution. One afternoon, she found Ben unloading donated fencing near the barn. "This has gone too far," she told him. "People are spending money they need." Ben set down the roll carefully. "Most are giving what they can. And if we lose the orchard anyway, then they helped you stand through it." Margaret looked toward the road where another fundraiser sign had been tied to the fence. "I don't want to become the reason everyone feels disappointed." Ben's expression softened. "You think this is only about keeping your land? It isn't. People are remembering what Ethan taught them about showing up." Margaret had no answer. Later that week, Daniel Ross called from the bank and asked her to come in. She arrived carrying the fundraising ledger and every updated financial record. Daniel reviewed the numbers carefully. He seemed genuinely impressed by the amount raised, but his expression remained troubled. "The support is remarkable," he said. "Can the auction be delayed?" Margaret asked. Daniel shook his head. "The legal process has advanced too far. Unless the required amount is received before the deadline, the auction will proceed as scheduled." "What about a partial payment? It will reduce the balance, but it won't stop foreclosure." Margaret stared at the figures. "How much time do we have?" Daniel pointed to the date printed on the notice. 23 days. She returned home in silence. Lily and Clara were waiting at the kitchen table with updated totals from the latest events. Ben arrived minutes later carrying another envelope of donations from the volunteer fire department. Together, they counted every check, bill, and coin, then compared the sum against Daniel's required payoff figure. The room slowly lost its earlier hope. They had raised more than anyone believed possible in such a short time. It was still not nearly enough. Margaret looked at the paper apples covering the kitchen wall, Ethan's journal resting beneath them, and the foreclosure notice beside the ledger. Ben finally spoke. "We keep going." Margaret traced the remaining balance with one finger. Even after everything the town had given, they were still tens of thousands of dollars short. The remaining 23 days began disappearing faster than Margaret could count them. Each morning brought another orchard task, another donation envelope, and another reminder that the bank's deadline would not move simply because the town had tried its best. Volunteers continued arriving before sunrise. Some repaired ladders and irrigation lines. Others cleared weeds, checked storage bins, or loaded crates for early apple varieties nearing harvest. Margaret still felt uneasy watching neighbors work without pay, but she no longer asked them to leave. She had finally understood that refusing every offer did not protect anyone's dignity. It only prevented people from giving what they had freely chosen to give. One morning, Ben found her standing near the packing shed, studying the rows of trees. "Fruit's ready on the southern slope," he said. Margaret nodded. "I know. We should start picking tomorrow. There aren't enough workers." Ben smiled. "There will be." The next day, nearly 40 volunteers arrived carrying gloves, baskets, and borrowed ladders. Farmers came after finishing their own chores. Teachers brought older students for supervised afternoon shifts. Retired orchard workers returned with the easy confidence of people who still remembered every row. Lily organized teams while Clara recorded names and hours, insisting that the effort become part of the town archive. Margaret stood near the first row, overwhelmed by the sight of so many people preparing to harvest fruit from land that might soon belong to someone else. "I should be paying them," she whispered. Lily looked at her carefully. "Dad gave people work when they needed it. Today, they need to help." Margaret swallowed hard and handed the first empty basket to a young volunteer. "Then let's not waste daylight." The orchard came alive with voices, footsteps, and the soft thud of apples settling into padded crates. Children carried smaller baskets. Experienced workers checked fruit for bruising. Ben moved between teams, repairing loose ladder braces and reminding everyone to avoid overloaded branches. Margaret worked beside them, showing newcomers how to twist each apple gently rather than pull. For the first time since Ethan's death, the harvest did not feel like a burden resting solely on her shoulders. By evening, the packing shed held more fruit than she and Lily could have gathered in a week. A local grocer purchased several pallets at a fair price. 2 restaurants ordered apples for pies and cider. The income helped cover immediate operating expenses, but the foreclosure balance remained far beyond reach. Still, the successful harvest gave the volunteers renewed energy. More small events were organized. A church held a breakfast. The fire department auctioned donated tools. Children sold painted orchard stones from a table outside the library. Every contribution mattered. Yet the total climbed too slowly. At night, Margaret studied the ledger while Lily updated figures on her laptop. The gap had narrowed, but not enough. "We may have to prepare ourselves," Margaret said one evening. Lily stopped typing. "For the auction?" Margaret nodded. "I don't want the town believing we're guaranteed to save it." "Nobody believes that. Then why do they keep acting hopeful? Lily looked toward the paper apples still covering the kitchen wall. Because hope is something people do, Mom. It isn't a promise. Margaret closed the ledger. Ethan had often said similar things in simpler ways. Planting trees was never a guarantee. Frost, hail, pests, and drought could undo years of labor. Yet each spring, they planted again. Later that night, Margaret returned to Ethan's journals. She had read most of the notebook found beneath the bench, but Clara had helped locate 2 additional journals in a locked drawer inside Ethan's office. The final entries had been written during the months before his death. They contained fewer orchard notes and more reflections, as though Ethan had sensed time moving faster than he wanted. In one entry, he wrote about helping a family repair their barn after a windstorm. He described their embarrassment at accepting assistance and ended with a sentence Margaret read aloud to Lily. Kindness becomes a burden only when we turn it into a debt. Lily leaned closer. He knew exactly what you'd struggle with. Margaret gave a sad smile. He knew me better than I knew myself. Another entry described a teenager Ethan had hired years earlier. The boy had returned as an adult and offered to repay every dollar Ethan once advanced to his family. Ethan refused. I told him to help someone else when the chance comes, he wrote. Goodness should move forward, not backward. Margaret slowly turned the page. Near the end of the journal, Ethan reflected on the orchard itself. He wrote that land was never truly owned in the way people imagined. Families cared for it for a time, then passed it forward. The value of Harper Orchard, he believed, was not measured only by acres, trees, or harvest income. It was measured by the people who had learned there, worked there, eaten from it, and found help there when life became difficult. He never mentioned expecting repayment from anyone. He never imagined that his kindness might one day return to protect the farm. Instead, his final line on the subject read, If this orchard survives me, let it survive as a place where nobody is ashamed to need help. Margaret pressed her fingers against the page. For weeks, she had believed accepting assistance betrayed the independence Ethan valued. Now she realized the opposite was true. He had spent his life teaching others that receiving help was not failure. She had simply never expected to become the person who needed that lesson most. Lily sat quietly beside her. The town isn't only saving trees, she said. They're saving what Dad made this place mean. Margaret looked toward the dark orchard beyond the window. And if they can't, then what he built still exists in them. The words brought comfort, but they did not remove the deadline. With 12 days remaining, the fundraising total was still thousands below what the bank required. Volunteers kept harvesting, more fruit was sold, families continued donating what they could. Margaret no longer refused their efforts. But she also refused to pretend the numbers had become less serious. One afternoon, Clara arrived at the farmhouse carrying a folded newspaper and breathing as though she had hurried from town. You need to see this, she said. On the front page was a photograph of Ethan standing at the edge of an old harvest festival picture, nearly hidden behind a group of smiling children. Above it, a large headline read, The Farmer Who Never Asked to Be Remembered. The article told the stories from Ethan's journals, described the foreclosure, and invited former residents to share what Harper Orchard had meant to them. At the bottom of the page, the reporter had printed the bank deadline. Margaret looked at Clara, then at Lily. The story was no longer confined to their small town. By the next morning, the article had traveled far beyond the county. Lily discovered the first messages before breakfast. Former residents had shared the story online, adding memories of school trips, harvest jobs, and boxes of fruit delivered during difficult years. Some recognized Ethan's name immediately. Others remembered the orchard before they remembered the man, then realized the quiet farmer in the photographs had once helped their families. The farmhouse phone began ringing before 8. Clara called from the library to say people were asking how to contribute. Ben arrived carrying a stack of envelopes already left at the feed store. Margaret stood in the kitchen, still wearing her work gloves, while Lily opened the first letter. It came from a woman living 3 states away. She wrote that Ethan had hired her at 16 after her mother lost work. The money she earned bought school clothes for her younger brothers. Enclosed was a check and a note. He gave me dignity when I thought we had nothing. Margaret sat down slowly. The second letter came from a retired truck driver who remembered breaking down near the orchard during a winter storm. Ethan had repaired a fuel line, fed him supper, and refused payment. Another came from a former teacher whose class had visited Harper Orchard every autumn. She wrote that Ethan never charged children whose families could not afford the trip. Each envelope carried money, but the stories felt heavier than the checks. By noon, Lily had created separate piles for donations, letters, and contact information. Clara brought archival boxes so nothing would be lost. "These belong with the journals," she said. Margaret looked at the growing stack. "He never knew any of this would come back. That's why it means something," Clara replied. Donations arrived in every form. A former resident mailed $20 with an apology that it was not more. A family who had moved away decades earlier sent $500 and included a photograph taken beneath the oldest apple trees. An engineer named Thomas enclosed a letter confirming the journal entry Margaret had read weeks earlier. He wrote that Ethan's summer job had changed the direction of his life. He also sent a check large enough to make Lily stop speaking for several seconds. Margaret recognized him from the Christmas cards Ethan had saved. "He remembered," she whispered. "They all did." Lily said, "The fundraising total climbed faster than it had during every bake sale, concert, and market combined." Yet practical work continued. Apples still needed sorting. Damaged crates had to be replaced, and orders had to be delivered on time. Ben organized volunteers so Margaret and Lily could handle correspondence without losing the harvest. Trucks moved steadily along the gravel lane. The packing shed stayed busy from dawn until evening. Margaret began each day among the trees and ended it at the kitchen table reading letters from people she had not seen in years. One afternoon, a familiar sedan stopped beside the farmhouse. A gray-haired man stepped out and introduced himself as Thomas Reed. Though Margaret already knew his name from Ethan's journal, he had driven 4 hours after seeing the newspaper article. "I wanted to bring this myself," he said, holding out an envelope. Margaret invited him inside. Thomas looked around the kitchen as though revisiting a place from another lifetime. "Ethan used to feed me lunch here when I worked summers," he recalled. "I pretended I brought enough food, but he always knew I hadn't." Margaret smiled. He knew when everyone was hungry. Thomas glanced toward Ethan's journal on the table. "He made me believe accepting help didn't make me weak." Margaret lowered her eyes. "I'm still learning that." Thomas placed the envelope beside the ledger. "Then maybe this is his lesson coming back around." He stayed only an hour, but before leaving, he walked through the orchard with Margaret and pointed out the row where Ethan had first taught him to prune. The trees had grown thick and tall. Thomas rested one hand against a trunk and quietly thanked a man who was no longer there. More visitors followed. Some were former workers. Others were families who had once received food, repairs, or quiet loans. Maggie found herself reconnecting with people whose lives had moved far beyond town. They spoke of Ethan without turning him into someone perfect. They remembered his stubbornness, his dry jokes, his habit of working through lunch, and his refusal to accept praise. Those ordinary details comforted her most. They returned him to her not as a legend, but as the husband she knew. With 6 days remaining, the total came within $15,000 of the bank's required amount. Hope spread carefully through town. Ben refused to celebrate early, but volunteers worked with renewed energy. Clara extended library hours so donations could be received securely. Lily updated the ledger twice a day and delivered copies to Daniel Ross at the bank. Daniel verified which funds had cleared and warned them that personal checks arriving too late might not count before the deadline. That practical obstacle changed everything. Several promised donations were still in transit. Others required processing time. Money pledged isn't the same as money available, Daniel explained over the phone. Lily wrote down every requirement. What's the latest possible time funds must be verified before the auction begins? Margaret listened from across the kitchen. The auction notice remained pinned beside the ledger. Its date now only 4 days away. The next morning, donations arrived from a group of former residents who had organized their own collection. A retired nurse sent savings she said came from years of remembering the fruit Ethan delivered to her family during her father's illness. The total rose again 2 days before the auction. They were less than $5,000 short. Margaret stood beneath the paper apples on the kitchen wall while Lily counted cleared funds for the 3rd time. Ben paced near the door. Clara read each number aloud to prevent mistakes. When they finished, silence filled the room. They had raised an amount none of them would have believed possible a month earlier. It was still not enough. Lily looked at her mother. "There are more checks coming tomorrow. They may not clear," Margaret said. Ben stopped pacing. "People are still trying." Margaret nodded, but the hope she had allowed herself now felt dangerously fragile. She walked outside before anyone could answer. Evening settled across the orchard, turning the rows of trees into long, dark lines against the fading sky. She placed one hand on the nearest trunk and thought of Ethan's final journal entry. Goodness should move forward, not backward. The town had carried his kindness farther than she ever imagined. Still, when the last verified total arrived from Daniel that night, the figure remained $2,700 below the amount required to stop the auction. Auction morning arrived beneath a pale gray sky that matched the quiet mood settling over Harper Orchard. Margaret woke before dawn, though she had barely slept. She moved through the familiar kitchen by habit rather than hunger, making coffee she never drank. The foreclosure notice still rested beside the fundraising ledger, now covered with notes, cleared receipts, and carefully organized totals. Lily entered a few minutes later carrying her laptop. She checked the bank account once more before looking at her mother. Nothing had changed overnight. They were still $2,700 short based on verified funds. Margaret folded Ethan's final journal closed and placed it gently inside the drawer where she had begun keeping his notebooks together. "Ready?" Lily asked softly. Margaret nodded. "As ready as I'll ever be." Outside, the orchard stood quiet beneath the early light. Dew rested on the leaves, and the first birds had begun their morning songs. Margaret walked slowly to the oldest section of trees before leaving. She rested one hand against the trunk Ethan's grandfather had planted decades earlier. 3 generations of her family had cared for this land. She whispered a quiet goodbye, not because she wanted to surrender it, but because she could not bear the thought of leaving without saying farewell if the day ended badly. By 7 o'clock, vehicles had already begun gathering outside the county courthouse. Margaret had expected only a handful of neighbors, but the parking lot filled steadily. Farmers stood beside teachers. Firefighters greeted retired orchard workers. Parents arrived with children who still carried paper apples they had made for the fundraiser. Clara Jenkins organized folders containing donation records, while Ben directed people toward the entrance without allowing the crowd to block public access. No one shouted, no one protested. They simply came to stand beside Margaret. Daniel Ross stepped outside the courthouse shortly after arriving from the bank. He walked directly toward Margaret with quiet professionalism. "Good morning," he said gently. "Any updates?" Margaret asked. Daniel checked his folder. Several electronic transfers cleared overnight. They're already included in yesterday's verified total. Lily looked hopeful for only a second before Daniel continued. "There are still mailed cashier's checks expected this morning, but they have not arrived." Margaret thanked him. She appreciated that he never offered false optimism. He had been honest from the beginning, even when honesty hurt. Inside the courthouse, officials arranged paperwork for the scheduled auction. The process continued because legally it had to. Outside, volunteers placed a folding table near the entrance for anyone bringing last-minute contributions. Clara and Lily carefully logged each donation while issuing handwritten receipts. Every dollar was counted twice before being sealed into deposit envelopes. A retired couple arrived carrying a small envelope filled with savings they had set aside for a vacation. "Your husband fixed our roof after the tornado," the husband explained. "We've wanted to repay him for years." Margaret tried to refuse. The woman smiled kindly. "You're not refusing us today." Margaret accepted the envelope with trembling hands. Soon afterward, several high school graduates who had worked summer harvests years earlier appeared together. Each contributed what they could. One admitted it was only $40. Margaret thanked him as sincerely as she had thanked those giving hundreds. Ethan's journals had taught her that generosity was never measured by the size of the gift. As the morning passed, the total climbed steadily. Lily updated the ledger after every verified contribution. Ben drove twice to the nearby bank branch to deposit cash immediately so Daniel could confirm available funds. The difference between pledged money and cleared money had become critically important. Time mattered as much as generosity. Shortly before 10 o'clock, Clara hurried across the courthouse lawn carrying another stack of envelopes. "These came from the post office," she said breathlessly. Among them were 2 certified cashier's checks mailed by former residents after reading the newspaper story. "Because they were certified funds." Daniel confirmed they could be processed immediately. Lily entered the amounts into the ledger. Margaret watched the remaining balance shrink again. "How close?" Ben asked. Lily looked up. $900. Hope spread quietly through the gathered crowd, but no one celebrated. They all understood how quickly expectations could become disappointment. Another 20 minutes passed. A local restaurant owner arrived with proceeds from a breakfast fundraiser held that same morning. A church youth group delivered jars filled with coins collected over the previous week. Volunteers counted everything carefully beneath Clara's supervision. The remaining balance fell again. $312. Lily announced. Margaret closed her eyes briefly. They had come farther than she ever believed possible. Yet the numbers still remained. Inside the courthouse, staff members began moving toward the auction room. Daniel glanced at his watch. "We have a little time," he said quietly, though everyone understood exactly how little. Just then, an elderly woman Margaret did not recognize stepped carefully from a taxi parked near the curb. She carried a worn leather purse and walked slowly toward the donation table. "Are you Margaret Harper?" she asked. Margaret nodded. The woman smiled warmly.
My brother never forgot your husband.
She explained that decades earlier, her brother had become stranded during a winter storm while traveling through the county. Ethan had repaired his truck, given him food, and refused payment. Her brother had passed away several years earlier, but after reading the newspaper article, she discovered an old envelope among his belongings labeled, "For the farmer who helped me, if I ever find him again." She handed it to Margaret. Inside was a cashier's check, carefully preserved all those years. Margaret looked at the amount, then immediately handed it to Lily without speaking. Lily checked the figure twice before looking toward Daniel. He accepted the check, verified the certification, and walked quickly inside the courthouse. Every conversation outside seemed to stop. No one moved except Daniel disappearing through the doorway with the final envelope. Minutes stretched painfully. Margaret found herself staring at the courthouse entrance instead of the ledger. She no longer cared about the exact numbers. She only wanted certainty. At last, Daniel returned carrying the updated receipt. He walked directly toward Margaret before speaking. "The final payment has been received." Relief swept through the crowd, but Daniel gently raised one hand. "The funds still require formal verification by the bank before the auction can legally be stopped." Silence returned immediately. Margaret looked at the courthouse doors, knowing that everything now depended on the final confirmation taking place inside. Daniel disappeared behind the courthouse doors, carrying the final certified check and the sealed deposit records. The heavy wooden door closed quietly behind him, leaving the crowd outside with nothing to do except wait. Margaret stood beside Lily without speaking. Around them, conversations faded into whispers before disappearing altogether. Even the children who had spent the morning carrying paper apples now stood silently beside their parents. Ben folded his arms and looked toward the courthouse entrance every few seconds. Clara kept the donation ledger pressed against her chest, though there were no more numbers left to write. Everything that could be done had already been done. Inside, bank employees compared deposit receipts with certified funds, electronic transfers, and cleared cashier's checks. Daniel had explained earlier that every payment had to be confirmed before the foreclosure account could legally be closed. One error, one unverified check, or one delayed transfer could prevent the payment from being recognized before the auction. Margaret understood the process, yet knowing the reason behind the delay did nothing to make the waiting easier. She found herself thinking about Ethan instead of the bank. She imagined him standing beside her with his calm voice, reminding her that worrying never made the clock move faster. He had always faced difficult seasons, one day at a time. Late frosts, hailstorms, insects, drought. He never pretended those problems were small. He simply dealt with each one as it arrived. Margaret took a slow breath and tried to do the same. Lily slipped her hand into her mother's. "Whatever happens," she said quietly, "I'm proud of you." Margaret looked at her daughter. "For almost losing the orchard?" Lily shook her head. "For letting people help." Margaret smiled faintly. "That may have been the hardest part." Nearby, Ben spoke softly with several volunteers about returning borrowed tables and chairs once everything was finished. No one discussed failure anymore. Whether the auction proceeded or not, they had already witnessed something none of them expected. An entire community had come together without being asked, giving time, labor, money, memories, and trust because one quiet farmer had once done the same for them. Clara watched the courthouse doors thoughtfully. "Your husband would probably be hiding somewhere if he saw all this attention," she said. Margaret laughed for the first time that day. "He'd be out in the orchard pretending the trees needed him." Exactly. The laughter eased some of the tension surrounding them. Nearly 30 minutes passed before Daniel finally reappeared. Several people instinctively stepped forward, but he raised one hand politely. His expression remained professional, making it impossible to guess the outcome. He walked directly toward Margaret, carrying a thick folder beneath one arm. "The bank has completed its verification," he said. Margaret felt her heartbeat quicken. Daniel opened the folder and carefully removed a single document. "Every certified check has cleared. Every electronic transfer has posted. Every cash deposit has been confirmed." He paused briefly before continuing. "The loan has been paid in full." For one long moment, no one reacted. The words seemed too extraordinary to believe. Then Lily threw her arms around her mother. Applause broke out across the courthouse lawn. Several people wiped tears from their eyes, while others embraced neighbors standing beside them. Ben removed his cap and quietly looked toward the sky, before shaking Daniel's hand. Clara lowered her head with visible relief. Margaret struggled to speak. "It's really over," she whispered. Daniel nodded. The debt has been fully satisfied. Before anyone could celebrate further, courthouse staff opened the main entrance and began carrying auction materials back toward their offices. The tables prepared for bidder registration were folded without ever being used. A clerk quietly removed the foreclosure notice posted near the entrance. Another official approached Daniel, who reviewed one final document before signing it. Margaret watched every movement carefully, needing to see each step with her own eyes. The legal process that had threatened her family's future was ending piece by piece. Daniel returned carrying another paper. "There is one final administrative step," he explained. "The auction cannot simply disappear without a formal public notice." Margaret nodded. She understood. Procedures had guided every stage of the foreclosure. They would also guide its conclusion. News spread quickly through the crowd. Some people telephoned relatives who had donated from other towns. Others simply stood together smiling through tears. The celebration remained remarkably gentle. No one shouted triumphantly. Everyone seemed to recognize that the day represented something larger than a financial transaction. It honored years of quiet kindness finally coming home. A reporter approached Margaret asking for a statement. She hesitated before answering. "Please, don't make this about me," she said softly. "If you tell today's story, tell them about Ethan. Tell them about the people who remembered him." The reporter nodded respectfully. Nearby, Lily photographed the volunteers together on the courthouse steps. She insisted Clara stand in the middle while Ben tried unsuccessfully to move toward the back. "No hiding," Lily laughed. "Not today." Even Daniel allowed himself a small smile when she thanked him for treating her family with honesty from the very beginning. "I only did my job," he replied. Margaret answered gently. "You remembered there were people behind the paperwork." Daniel lowered his eyes. "That matters." By early afternoon, most of the crowd began returning home. Farmers still had livestock to feed. Teachers needed to prepare for school the following morning. Volunteers loaded folding tables into pickup trucks. The courthouse lawn slowly returned to its ordinary appearance. Margaret remained for a few moments longer, looking at the entrance where she had expected to lose everything. Instead, she was leaving with hope she had believed impossible only weeks earlier. As she turned toward the parking lot, Daniel called after her. He held one final sealed envelope. "This will be posted officially within the hour," he explained. Margaret accepted it carefully. Across the front were the words she had waited so long to hear. "Notice of public auction suspension pending official cancellation.
Margaret carried the sealed notice home on the passenger seat without opening it again. She no longer needed to read the words to believe them. The road back to Harper Orchard looked different than it had only that morning. The fields were the same, the fences unchanged, and the trees still stretched across the hills exactly as they always had.
Yet the crushing weight that had settled over every familiar landmark since Ethan's funeral had finally begun to lift. When she turned into the gravel lane, she found another surprise waiting. Dozens of neighbors had gathered beneath the oldest apple trees. Folding tables stood beneath white cloths. Children chased one another between the rows while volunteers carried covered dishes from pickup trucks. Someone had hung simple strings of lights between the branches, even though the sun had not yet begun to set. Margaret stopped the truck and looked at Lily.
You knew about this?
Lily smiled sheepishly.
Only a little. Ben asked me to keep you distracted.
Ben walked toward the truck, removing his cap with the same quiet smile Margaret had come to trust. "Before you say no," he began, "this isn't another fundraiser." Margaret laughed through tears.
Then what is it?
"A harvest supper."
We already had one.
"That one raised money," Ben replied. "This one is simply because we're grateful you're home." Margaret stepped from the truck and looked around. Clara waved from one of the tables while arranging framed copies of several photographs she had brought from the library archives. Daniel Ross arrived a few minutes later, no longer carrying folders or legal documents, only a homemade pie balanced carefully in both hands. Margaret greeted him warmly.
I suppose bankers eat pie too, she said.
Daniel smiled, especially after paperwork like today's. Laughter spread easily through the gathering. For the first time in many weeks, conversations no longer revolved around deadlines, balances, or auctions. Instead, people talked about harvest recipes, grandchildren, weather forecasts, and plans for autumn. The ordinary nature of those conversations comforted Margaret more than any speech could have. Ordinary life had returned. As evening settled across the orchard, everyone shared food beneath the trees Ethan loved. Children carried baskets of fresh apples from table to table. Local musicians played familiar songs without using a stage or microphone. Some couples danced slowly on the grass, while older neighbors watched with quiet smiles. Margaret wandered through the gathering, stopping to thank people individually. She no longer tried to repay every kindness with promises she could not keep. Instead, she listened. Emma Lewis hugged her tightly before saying,
Your husband once told me, people don't remember perfect harvests. They remember who stood beside them during difficult seasons.
Carl Henderson laughed while accepting another slice of pie. He also said never trust anyone who claimed farming was easy. Even Daniel shared a memory. Years earlier, before becoming bank manager, he had purchased apples from Ethan for a community event. When Daniel accidentally underpaid because of a bookkeeping mistake, Ethan never mentioned it. "I discovered the error weeks later," Daniel recalled. "When I apologized, he simply told me to buy extra apples for the children's school next year." Margaret smiled. "That sounds exactly right." After supper, Clara asked everyone to gather beneath the oldest tree. She carefully placed Ethan's weathered journal on a small wooden table beside the framed photographs.
Most of us knew Ethan only through pieces of his life, she said.
These journals helped us see how many quiet acts of kindness connected this town long before we realized it. She looked toward Margaret. "Would you like to say something?" Margaret hesitated. Public speaking had never come naturally. Ethan would have avoided it entirely. Yet she looked around at the faces surrounding her and understood they were not waiting for polished words. They were simply waiting for honesty. She stepped forward slowly.
After Ethan died, she began, I believed I had lost not only my husband, but everything we built together. Her voice trembled briefly before growing steadier. When I found his journals, I thought I was discovering secrets. Instead, I discovered the man I already loved, only more completely than before.
Several people nodded quietly. Margaret continued.
For weeks, I kept trying to refuse your help because I thought accepting it meant failing him. Then I read something he wrote. She opened the final journal to the page she had marked. Kindness becomes a burden only when we turn it into a debt. She closed the notebook gently. All of you helped me understand what he meant.
Tears glistened in many eyes. Margaret looked around the orchard before speaking again.
You didn't save this place because you owed Ethan something. You saved it because he taught all of us that caring for each other is simply what neighbors do. Silence settled comfortably beneath the trees.
It was not empty silence, but the kind shared among people who understood one another without needing more words. Lily stepped beside her mother.
We've been talking, she said, smiling toward Clara and Ben. The orchard has always belonged to our family, but it has also belonged to this community in another way. Margaret nodded. They had discussed the idea together during the drive home from the courthouse. We want to make sure that never changes, Margaret said. She explained that every autumn, Harper Orchard would host a free community harvest day for local families, schools, and volunteers. Children would learn how fruit was grown. Older residents would be invited to share memories of the town's history. Ethan's journals, along with the letters and photographs gathered during the fundraiser, would be preserved with Clara's help, so future generations could understand why the orchard mattered beyond its harvest. The announcement was met not with loud applause, but with warm smiles that spread naturally through the crowd.
It felt less like introducing something new than continuing a tradition Ethan had quietly begun years earlier. As darkness settled, the strings of lights hanging between the branches began to glow. Margaret slipped away from the gathering for a few moments and walked alone to the oldest tree in the orchard. The sounds of laughter drifted softly across the grass behind her. She rested one hand against the rough bark, just as she had on the morning she believed she was saying goodbye forever.
You were right, she whispered into the evening. Goodness does move forward. She looked back toward the farmhouse. Lily was laughing with Ben while Clara showed children old photographs spread across one of the tables. Daniel was helping stack empty dishes without being asked. Neighbors who had once arrived as volunteers now looked simply like friends enjoying the close of a long day together. Margaret realized the orchard had never been saved by one generous donation or one dramatic moment. It had been saved by hundreds of quiet choices, each one connected to another, stretching backward through Ethan's life and forward into the future. The trees surrounding her would continue to grow. New harvests would come. Children not yet born would someday walk these rows without knowing how close the orchard had come to disappearing. Perhaps they would read Ethan's journals. Perhaps they would hear stories from grandparents who remembered the summer everyone worked together. Either way, the true inheritance would not be the land itself. It would be the lesson rooted within it, that kindness given freely has a way of returning when it is needed most, often through hands we never expected. Margaret stood beneath the old tree until the stars appeared above the orchard. Then she turned, walked back toward the lights, and joined the people who had become part of her family's story. Knowing that Harper Orchard would continue growing not only apples, but the quiet generosity that had saved it. The greatest mystery was never hidden inside Ethan Harper's journals. It was hidden inside the ordinary lives of the people around him. Every repaired tractor, every anonymous utility bill, every quiet job offered to someone in need, every basket of apples delivered without expecting thanks seemed small when viewed alone. Ethan never kept careful records so people would repay him.
He kept them only to remind himself that kindness mattered, even when no one noticed. After his death, those countless unnoticed moments formed an invisible network connecting an entire community. When Margaret believed she was standing alone, she discovered she was surrounded by people whose lives had been quietly changed years before. The orchard was never saved by one wealthy donor, one miracle, or one dramatic act. It was saved because hundreds of ordinary acts of compassion accumulated over decades until they became stronger than fear, stronger than grief, and ultimately, stronger than foreclosure itself. Margaret's greatest transformation was not learning how to save the orchard. It was learning how to receive the same generosity her husband had spent a lifetime giving away. She realized that accepting help is not weakness, pride is not strength, and true community exists when people are willing both to give and to receive with gratitude. Ethan's final legacy was not the land, the harvest, or even the journals he left behind. His true inheritance was a way of living that continued long after he was gone. Every person who chose to help Harper Orchard became proof that kindness is never lost. It travels quietly from one life to another until one day it returns exactly where it is needed most. The lesson of Harper Orchard is simple. The wealthiest people are not always those who possess the most, but those who leave behind the greatest number of lives made better because they were here. Land can be inherited, buildings can be repaired, money can be earned again, but a reputation for quiet goodness becomes a legacy that no auction, no debt, and no passing of time can ever take away.